Board. Okay. Okay. Hi, everybody. My name is Pádraig Finnerty, and I'm the president of the Emily Dickinson International Society. I'm also the person who organizes our regular research events. And I'm absolutely delighted today that this is a co hosted event, and I'm co hosting it with Thomas Howard, who is the president elect of the Emerson Society. So I'll turn over to you, Thomas.
Thank you a lot. Yeah, I'm Thomas. I teach at Bilkent University in Turkey. Although right now, if I can show you, I'm in the middle of the woods in Michigan. So if I freeze up, it's just because I have bad service over here. Um, but yeah, we were really excited about this. Actually, some of this came together when we were at the last Emily Dickinson conference in Taiwan. Parag and I were just talking about things that our societies could do together and discussions that we could have together. So that's sort of where this emerged from. What we thought would be a good idea, since there's people from two societies in the meeting, if we could go around maybe and just have really brief introductions about from who's here. Maybe I'll call on someone. Okay, Dan, I saw you. You can go ahead
Sure.
first.
I'll start. I'm Dan Mannheim. I'm vice president of the Dickinson Society, and I edit the newsletter, the Emily Dickinson International Society Bulletin.
Do we want to popcorn it to someone? Is that easier to call someone's name?
Wendy, why don't you go next?
It was a subtle way to volunteer. Hi, everyone. I'm Wendy. I am at Queens College in the CUNY system. I help with the pedagogy community, and I'm on the board of the Emily Dickinson Society. And I will popcorn it to someone I don't know, Christopher.
Thanks, Wendy. I'm Chris Hanlon. I'm here through the Emerson Society. A long time ago, I wrote an MA thesis on Dickinson, but then I went conquered word. But I'm really pleased to be here. I will now send this to Joseph Urbas.
Thank you, Chris. Also a member of the Emerson Society, emeritus professor at the University of Bordeaux, Montaigne. And I guess I'll hand it off to Prentice Clark.
Thanks, Joseph. My name is Prentice Clark. I'm at the University of South Dakota, and I am a past president of the Emerson Society. I will hand it over to Ryan.
Thank you. I'm Ryan Cull. I'm a member of the board of the Emily Dickinson International Society. I teach at New Mexico State University in Las Cruces, New Mexico. And I will pass this on to Don Skog.
Hi, I'm Don Skoog. I'm a composer and writer in Oak Park, Illinois, and I'm the co-chair, along with George Baziewicz, of the Emily Dickinson Society Arts Community. I got to pick somebody, right? Hold on a second. Who haven't? Oh, Felicia.
I'm Felicia Nimua Ackerman. Felicia Nimua is a double name like Mary Jane. I am at Brown University in Providence, Rhode Island. You are looking at my wonderful cat, Winston, named after Winston Smith in 1984. I'm in the Emily Dickinson International Society, and I have frequent Emily Dickinson parodies in the bulletin. And I will pass this on to Yu Hang Tien. And please excuse me if I mispronounce your name. I apologize in advance.
No. Thank you so much. So I am Yu Hong Tian, and I'm just about to officially graduate from my PhD. So I'm actually going to fly to Edinburgh to join my graduation later this month. And then I'm part of the board of Emily Dickinson International Society. And then since I will actually publish a paper on Dickinson and Emerson, so that's why I also recently just joined the Emerson Society. So happy to be here, and I want to see more collaboration. So good to know all of you. And next one, I'm going to pass to Li Xing.
Hello, everyone. I'm Xu Lixing from Taiwan. I'm currently teaching at National Zhenjing University, which hosted the Dickinson conference last year. And I'm currently on the board as well. I'm really happy to be here to know so many great joint ventures between the two society. What a pleasure. Um, maybe I should pick Brunetta. Would that be okay?
Yeah, thank you, Lou. Hello, everybody. I'm Bruna. I'm a member of the Emily Dickinson International Society, and I'm joining from Tirana, Albania. And Emily is next.
All the controls are in a different spot. So, I'm Emily Seelbinder, a longtime member of the Emily Dickinson International Society, fortunate never to have served on the board. I've managed to avoid that. But I do serve as an organizer for the EDIS ALA panels, which is something I very much enjoyed. And just 2 weeks ago was at ALA in Chicago, and and then at my 50th college reunion. So I'm exhausted, but I'm also retired from Queen's University of Charlotte, soon to be united with Elon College. Previously, it was Queen's College, and sometimes we were confused with Wendy's institution. Longtime professor of literature there, where I taught American literature surveys that always included the essay, The Poet, as an introduction into a unit on 19th century poets. So I'm looking forward to this discussion, and I'll stop there. Oh, is there someone else? Wait a minute. Oh, Tammy Rose, go for it.
Hi there, everyone. My name is Tammy Rose, and I am a PhD student at Bentley University, which is in Waltham, Massachusetts, which is just a couple miles away from Concord and Walden Pond. I was lucky enough to actually, I think, meet some of you at the 2024 Emily Dickinson conference in Amherst, right? And then I have recently presented a part of my thesis at the Emerson Graduate Student Seminar, just, I guess, in the beginning of April. My PhD is on a case study of Concord. My PhD is focused on experience design. And my thesis is going to be Concord as a case study. So for those who are trying to keep track of which society has people on it, I'm a member of the Emily Dickinson Society, the Emerson Society, the Thoreau Alliance now as well, because I'm right near Concord. And I run a group online called Transcendental Concord. And it's kind of social media, mostly Facebook focused, just about bringing all of this stuff together and talking about it. So I'm part of everybody, I guess. I don't know.
Thank you, Tammy. I think we should have like a punch card or something. Like when you're a member of enough societies, you get some reward in the mail. I think that make sure, is there anyone that we didn't hear from? I'm looking through the list. I think that was everyone. Okay, wonderful. Well then I'll just open up with a few thoughts sort of on how this came together and why we're coming from this approach to talk about the poet and then to talk about probably the poet of certainly of New England when we're thinking about what Dickinson offered for her time. Um, One of the things that kind of struck me, I was actually just this week reading from the 2026 New Cambridge Companion of Ralph Waldo Emerson. In the introduction, Michael Johnnick has, almost as an aside, I want to read the quote. He says, Emily Dickinson, who did not know Emerson directly, nonetheless drew from a thematically similar cultural, theological, and aesthetic canvas, as did he, and her verse is in complicated and elliptical dialogue with his writing. What's kind of striking about this, I think we all have this sense that this is the relationship that could have been much more than it was. Why, for example, does Dickinson turn to Higginson rather than Emerson? What is the possible relationship that's going on here? There are some direct connections. They may have met, as far as I understand, there was one night in Amherst where Dickinson may have met Emerson, or at least they were very close to each other. Um, but that doesn't mean that they necessarily had a direct relationship. But we do know that Dickinson references Emerson's poems in her letters. And I just found out today from poetic that Dickinson's sister-in-law had a copy of Emerson's Essays second series, which means that it's very likely that Dickinson herself had read Emerson's essay, The Poet. So this just seems like a very fruitful place to begin our discussion. Although, as we were sort of talking about our plans for this meeting and for possible future meetings, there's just a lot of resonances between Dickinson and Emerson that we could spend more time on. In case you weren't familiar with The Poet, this is the first essay in Essay's second series. And Essay's second series, of course, by the name, this is his second published collection of essays. What's sort of interesting, you may have sort of picked up on this as you were reading it, maybe for the first time. It's a very long, dense piece of Emersonian writing. In part, this is because it was drawn together from three different lectures. One early review called it the least lucid of the essays in the collection, but another review calls it an appropriate transition essay. And so it's mostly in that sense that I think it's worth thinking about the poet when we're talking about Dickinson and Emerson. Emerson talked about poetry throughout his career, but this is really one place where he brings a lot of these ideas together. So maybe this is a good time to start. We sort of have a few specific places in the essay that seem like useful places to start. So maybe if you want to pull up the quotes you have in the PowerPoint if you're ready. Okay, wonderful. So here's our collection here. Emerson's the Poet, and then 4 poems by Dickinson. I think there's a lot of things we could talk about, and I think we hopefully will have some time where you can bring in whatever struck you when reading The Poet or when reading Dickinson's poetry, what these sort of resonances are. There's a lot of things that we could talk about. Emerson says that poems don't have to be long, for example. They can be short. He has a whole phrase about the poetry and intoxication, the centrifugal tendency of a man, a lot of things that we could think about when we're thinking of Dickinson and circumference, for example. But maybe the best place to begin is with what Emerson says about the poet sort of more generally, the poet as representative, and giving us the expression that we're looking for. So he says, for example, that all men live by truth and stand in need of expression, and adequate expression is rare. And then he turns to the figure of the poet, the one who's able to give us these things. So our first quote here, the poet is the person in whom these powers are in balance, the man without impediment, who sees and handles that which others dream of, traverses the whole scale of experience, and is representative of man, in virtue of being the largest power to receive and to impart. Maybe we'll talk about the meter making argument in a moment, but I think as we're thinking about how does perhaps Dickinson fit as being this representative figure, does she imagine herself as being that way as a poet? Maybe I'll turn it over, Parag, if you want to say some things about this.
Yeah, so I suppose, I mean, obviously this is a discussion, so I'm really excited to hear what you all think. But I suppose the first thing that strikes me is that because Dickinson is a woman, there's a sort of a sense in which that difficulty of maybe being representative, and I think a lot of feminist scholars, queer theorists, and people who've approached Dickinson have thought about her as somebody who's maybe uncomfortable with labels or names, and maybe particularly with some of the kind of power that is attached to maleness or masculinity at the time. So I suppose generally Dickinson is seen, I believe, as somebody who maybe is going to rewrite some of that kind of sense of representativeness that maybe is built into this, and maybe Dickinson is more wary about speaking for others, and I think she's also more concerned with maybe the difficulty of expression and language. So they would be some of my thoughts on this particular quotation, but maybe we can open it up to other people. Yeah, Emily?
I've been doing a lot of thinking recently about Dickinson and George Eliot, and in particular, what I would characterize as radical empathy in both. And I'm attempting to make the argument that what drew Dickinson, one of the things that drew Dickinson to Eliot early on, was the empathy, the expression of experience, the representative I, not it drives me crazy that people say that the I of Dickinson's poetry is Emily herself. Something I've fought 42 years of teaching. No, get away from the biography. And in recently doing some comparisons of passages from Janet's Repentance in Scenes of a Clerical Life and Dickinson, and in particular looking at that famous passage in Janet's Repentance regarding empathy and rejecting the greatest good for the greatest number in such a powerful way through the mother who's recently lost a child. That led me then to looking at some other passages and comparing Dickinson to the passages in Janet's Repentance that were marked by Emily and Sue when they were reading the volume that Samuel Bowles gave them. So I would make the argument, or I'm venturing to make the argument because I'm not there yet. I'm not there yet. Is that Dickinson's representative I expresses human experience in ways that I think Emerson simply couldn't imagine, or even Whitman. That there is a deep psychological realism in both Eliot and Dickinson. And if you think about Eliot's early narrator, the narrator is supposedly a country cleric. But there is an interiority that is palpable, and for me that shifts the representative men from the heroic figure to the ordinary figure, which is, I think, in keeping with the Romantics who made that claim, although they weren't very good at it either. The end.
Brilliant, thanks, Emily. Felicia Nimue?
I think a very good illustration of Emily's point is, had I not, had I not seen the sun, I could have borne the shade, but light a newer wilderness my wilderness hath made, which really responds to the way a lot of people feel in a very realistic, practical, non-grandiose way. It immediately hit home with me. One thing I would like to question, though, is the common tendency to see Emily Dickinson in terms of contemporary feminist or queer concerns. And I wonder to the extent that doing that really obscures her own distinctive vision. And I think it may really be best to see her in her own terms rather than to try to relate her to contemporary concerns of a different sort.
Okay. So sorry, and I just to qualify, what I meant was that just when people discuss Dickinson in relation to Emerson or male poets, they often have that kind of feminist, a kind of sense of thinking about Dickinson as rewriting male poets and figures. So that's just what I meant.
Thanks. What I'm doing is just questioning that. You know, I don't really know enough about her life to know how applicable that is. But I think.
Yeah. So sorry. I just meant that's where scholarship has gone with this discussion of Emerson and Dickinson. That's all. This is
okay. Thank you. I'm just questioning the direction. Thank you very much.
It's happened though. It's sort of that's.
I know that.
Okay.
I'm just questioning how well that really represents Emily's unique, specific, individual concerns.
Okay, no problem.
And I would bring to that Virginia Woolf's observation that the finest writers are androgynous. that there is a way of seeing that is neither masculine nor feminine. She makes that argument, I forget in which essay, but that representative. Woolf refers to Shakespeare that way, and let's think about Dickinson's huge admiration for Shakespeare and responsiveness to his work. So I agree that there's a hyper focus perhaps on feminist readings and queer readings, and I don't think they're out of order, but I do think they use up a lot of space.
Okay,
in the discussion. I saw you laughing, Don.
It's also worth noting that one of the other pieces that Emerson writes about poetry is in his Representative Men collection, where Shakespeare is the representative poet. So there's another stream of influence there. Chris, I see you have your hand up.
Thanks, Thomas. This is already such a fascinating exchange. I knew it would be. We should have more such exchanges like this between the Dickinson Society and the Emerson Society. When I was preparing for this discussion, I realized I've just got the good luck of having people who know a lot more about Dickinson than I do to help me. Because as I was reading the poetry that we've kind of set aside for this discussion, and particularly 448, Franklin 448, this was a poet, it is that. I wanted to ask the people who are way more up on Dickinson than I am about the relationship between this poem and another one that I teach all the time, numbered Franklin 675, Essential Oils Are Wrung. And it might be that my observations are pretty run-of-the-mill, but I found myself just recognizing connections between these two poems at the level of the words she's choosing, essence, attar, distills. Essential oils, as people here may know, is all about the process of making perfume, which is in that poem anyway, the process of pressing a flower until it is destroyed, and then we get its essential oils, and that sort of preserves the essence of the perfume. And Christine Miller, in an influential reading, of course, has urged us to consider that this is a poem about poems. This is Dickinson's theory at that point in her life anyway, of what it takes to make a poem, to destroy the general rose in order to get at an essence. I've always tried to think of that alongside Emerson's essay, The Poet, and failed because so often, like when Emerson talks about what a poet is, he winds up sounding very Platonic, doesn't he, in his way of sort of imagining that, well, what a poet is a person who has access to this ethereal region, and they just kind of write down the music they hear, right? They write down what they see, and some do it better than others, and some miss a word here and there, but it all ends up sounding like this very, it goes from God to the ethereal region to the poet, and it's all like the more passive the conduit, the better the poem, and so on. Whereas in Dickinson, in poems like certainly Essential Oils, but even This Was a Poet, it is that, all I get is a sense of ardor and friction and difficulty, and it is hard to be a poet. So these are really basic kind of elementary questions that I find myself circulating, and I don't mean to sideline Emerson Society members. I'd like to hear from you too on it, but I'm really particularly interested in what people who know Dickinson a lot better than me might have to say about such things.
And I will yield to someone else, as I have already spoken many times. So speak now if you wish to start. Where I would make a connection with the poet in both of these poems, but in particular, This Was a Poet, is in the word ordinary. And a passage that we're probably going to look at a little bit later, in Emerson's plea that the poet find in his or her inspiration, find that in the ordinary, and distill the ordinary. It is the poet who sees beyond the surface and into the essence of being. But that long paragraph, I don't have the essay in front of me. The long paragraph regarding the importance of the ordinary in poetic expression, and then also the passage where the poet is the one who reveals, of pictures the discloser. The poet it is he, entitled us by contrast to ceaseless poverty. I think of Thoreau talking about taking the property of the farmer who thinks he took just a few apples, but in fact he took the whole farm, in leaving that space. It is the poet who finds these riches in the ordinary. So that's where I make the connection, I think, with Dickinson, is in that word ordinary, and then in those essences, the attar, the essence, essential oils, and so forth. That there's a heightened. What happens with perfume is that there is a heightened expression, a greater sense. If you've ever been, say, to Grasse, where perfume is made, and I was there when lavender oils were being wrung, and the entire town was redolent of lavender, and that image stays with me when I read these two poems, and I think was useful when I was trying to explain some of what was going on in Dickinson here. So I would agree that these are poems about poetry and an expression of Dickinson's poetics, particularly the early poetics, that corresponds with the transcendentalists, but in Dickinson's own unique detours.
Yeah, I would agree. Don?
So I was put on Earth to state the obvious, and the thing that we really, the big point here is that even though both of them are both extremely poetic, they come at it from completely different manifestations. So if Dickinson is essential oils, I always think of Emerson as being maple syrup. So if I'm swimming through Emerson's maple syrup, just like endless pages of like the thickest prose, and which I kind of like, by the way, it's his profuse production really contrasts to her distilling things down to the very essence. Right, even though they're both poetic, and Emerson's poems are beautiful too, but thicker, right? So that's just a little comment that I have. Just wanted to put that out.
This might be a good time, Parag, to talk about the aphorism scholarship.
Yes. So I mentioned to Thomas this wonderful scholar, Carl Keller, and it was published in 1979. And he mentions the links to the poet and I Taste the Liquor Never Brewed. So not one of the poems that we're looking at. But he also looks at Dickinson's first lines and other lines from her poems. And he turns them into kind of aphorisms, sort of Emersonian aphorisms. So on pages 172 to about 178, like he just basically, I don't know whether you can see it there, but they're kind of aphorisms. So one of the things that struck me reading the poet was that aphoristic style that Emerson has, and actually that can be connected with some of Dickinson's first lines or last lines. So that was just something that occurred to me. I don't know whether anybody had any similar thoughts.
Well, and maybe I'll just add that because I mean, with my own research, I do a lot with the aphorism, although I define it differently than what that research is saying. But it is, I think, striking that Dickinson calls herself, when she's writing to Higginson, calls herself his gnome, like your gnome is how she signs one of her letters. And then, so this gnomic idea of her writing, which is just very clear in how she is, But then also with Emerson himself, he does. I like this maple syrup analogy because he just adds it. They're there. There's all these short lines throughout his essay, but they're mixed in with these longer, sometimes rambling sentences um, that make it more difficult to pick out. But I mean, Laura Dalsell Walls talks about his like gnomic science. So also Emerson has this gnomic tendency as well, despite the fact that they perhaps appear in the finished product differently.
Dan.
I'm struggling to articulate what Thomas's statement has said, because there is something similar about the act of reading the two of them, even though the texture of the language is so different. And that, neither one of them holds still. I used to teach. I mean, I would start my Dickinson course with Emerson, and I used to do a Dickinson Whitman course, and I would do this essay, and then to say, okay, what are each of them drawing out? And the students and I wouldn't get much farther than simply talking about that, are they saying the same thing? In some sense, the aphoristic quality. And it is not that hard to do what Keller did in that book, which is just to lay out, you see, she's saying this and he's saying that. It's so neat. But it only works if you extract an individual statement from the context. And that's so tempting to do with Emerson. There are calendars with Emersonian statements on a new day, and it's a little inspirational thing from Emerson. And yet, when you look at it as you read the essay, yeah, he says that, but then like 3 lines later, he's saying something completely different. And the work of reading an Emerson essay is the work of being inspired and forgetting what inspired you a minute ago to be inspired by something else, and then having to let it all go, and it vanishes. Self-consuming artifacts, as another critic called them many years ago. And in some sense, Dickinson poems, whether they are re-articulating Emerson ideas or challenging them, work the same way, that you will get a momentary insight, but it doesn't hold still because of the incompletion of her syntax, of pictures, the discloser dash, the poet dash, it is he dash, entitles us by contrast to ceaseless poverty, that, we could redo the punctuation to make it make a little bit more sense, and establish some of the particles as assembling meaning in a conventional way. But whatever her dashes do, they defy you to do that. And so there is still, not exactly an Emersonian way, but there's this destabilizing of any coherent reading that you might be trying to assemble.
So thank you so much, Dan. So Joseph, I have you up next, but then we've got lots of other people. So maybe we could start with you, Joseph.
Okay. My question is to the Dickinson scholars. It's a rather simple question. Do you think that Emily Dickinson would have felt vindicated by Emerson's definitions? For example, for it is not meters, but meter making argument that makes a poem. Would she have, do you think, based on what you understand of her work and worldview, have felt herself vindicated, challenged, I don't know, denied? Any ideas in that regard? I'm particularly interested in the not meters, but meter making argument, because it seems to me from my relatively unschooled reaction to Emily Dickinson that we are getting arguments in there. We are getting arguments in there that are in her own particular meter.
In Prague, we do have that quote on one of the slides, the meter making argument.
Yeah.
Number 3.
Yep, there we are. So yeah. So will I read? For it is not meters, but a meter making argument that makes a poem, a thought so passionate and alive that, like the spirits of a plant or an animal, it has an architecture of its own and adorns nature with a new thing. So I would say, yes, Dickinson definitely is inspired by this. And even that idea of being passionate and alive, when she writes to Higginson, she wants to know if her poetry is alive, if it breathes. So I think, and I think her meter is incredibly important to her, and she sticks with the general kind of hymn ballad meter. So I think, but she also, as you say, makes arguments and creates sort of a kind of philosophical dialogues and things. So that would be my opinion. But maybe Wendy or Li Xing or you've got your hand up as well. Would anybody like to add? No.
Yeah, and sorry, I have both a cat meowing and planes flying overhead living in New York City. If you hear lots of noise, I'm sorry. I guess I was going to respond to two things. The thing that Dan said, and I guess what we're talking about here, which is I think one thing that does bring them together for me, not to say that they're the same, but is Emerson, I love this essay, The Poet, and in part, he makes statements and then undoes those statements or doubles those statements or like circles them, right? So his own argument or his own statements are never stable. I'm not an Emerson scholar, but Dickinson feels quite similar to me in how she's kind of working with the relationship between thought and concept, or thought and symbol, right? And the ways in which she's kind of undoing as a way of understanding, which often means coming to no conclusion, right? How many of Dickinson's poems kind of dissolve without having any kind of finish. And the other thing I wanted to say, which was just the other thing that brings them together for me, is their relationship to the emerging field of natural history, especially geology. Like in this essay, Emerson has his language as fossil poetry statement. And many people here know that I've been working on volcanoes, and Emerson he mentions Chimborazo in a really interesting ways, which is an Ecuadorian volcano that Dickinson also mentions. And I think the ways in which they're kind of responding to discoveries or questions emerging from science is also really interesting.
Right. I could sort of chip in and sort of follow up on what Wendy just mentioned earlier, because I was also thinking about the connection between aphorism and the use of emblems and the emphasis on form in Emerson and this meter making argument. For me, Dickinson seemed to do a bit of both, like induction and deduction. I find her poems really helpful in terms of my teaching of writing in like the use of syllogism, for example, A is B, B is C, so A is C, for example, in the way to think about how thoughts can progress. And I feel like her distilling of certain ordinary like sense into a specific meaning is very much also some kind of almost like argument making or scientific process of inducing something from the specific to the general, or deducing something which is very much general to something very specific. It seemed to me that Emerson is doing roughly the same thing, but they're like using different methodologies. And the visual element there, I think, is also quite important, apart from the word, the importance of the word or logo. Because in Emerson, there's this whole section in the poet about how poems are a picture language. I think that's what he said there. He focuses on the visual and emblematic, and that form of extraction itself is very much in Dickinson as well. The extraction of meaning into something else or transforming it into something else there. I think that's probably one of the following quotes there. So I thought there are all that meter making itself. It's on the like a poet in a poetic sense is both very much visual and very much linguistic or semantic, which I think it's very much something that Emerson is doing as well there. So there will be something I think it's relevant there. Thanks.
I just wanted to jump in. Yeah, actually, it's funny, before this meeting, I had a whole section on like Emerson, the poet, and science, because he does say a lot of things about science and the role of poetry there. What he says here about the picture language, which I think is on one of the other slides. I think we do have that quote. Yeah, nature offers all her creatures to him a picture language. I mean, one of the most famous lines from Emerson's earlier piece, Nature, is about how every man's condition is a solution in hieroglyphic. So again, thinking of like hieroglyphics and picture language and what the emblem means, I think those are all very relevant. Prentice, noticed you had your hand up. I don't know if you wanted to jump in or if we want to move.
I don't know. I feel like we have so many things on the table, and I'm wanting to circle back to like Dan's comment, but
Yeah,
also
circles that works for both Dickinson and Emerson, so that's an appropriate thing to do.
sure. No, I don't know, and I'll just be quick because I know a lot of people have hands up. But so responding to Dan, but also Wendy, I liked your description of undoing as a way of understanding, and I feel like a word that hasn't been tossed out yet is indirection, and how Emerson and Dickinson, in some ways, I wonder if they're working by indirection in certain ways. And I'm thinking of, I don't know, what I think is maybe a connection between them in terms of like what Stanley Cavell says when he says that we don't know the existence of the world with certainty. Our relation to existence is deeper, and how maybe in some ways, right, that Emerson in his experiments in his form and Dickinson in hers are exploring how our relationship to the world is not a matter of knowledge as traditionally conceived, but a matter of, what Emerson would call like glad and conspiring reception, or Dickinson, right? Like, philosophy doesn't know. It's through a riddle that we have to go, or it's through slant, or it's indirection. And how maybe that sort of their relationship to epistemology and knowing the world also seems connected to the ways in which their forms are similar and different. But I liked Wendy your comment about undoing as a way of understanding.
Christopher?
You're still muted.
Sorry. I just have a few disorganized things to add, again, just that are inspired by things people have said. Before I get to any of that, I'll do it quickly. I wanted to just say, so far this exchange is so interesting to me. Anyone who has a mind to writing about Emerson and Dickinson and is looking for a place where to submit, I'd ask you to just consider our journal at the Emerson Society, The Dial. I've just put the link in chat. This conversation already sounds a lot like something out of our forum section, where we publish shorter pieces that are statements about possibilities and notions, sometimes half done, right? That just maybe are pregnant with possibility. You have me thinking about an exchange I had with students this semester about Dickinson's poem, Faith is a Fine Invention, which, to be honest, it's never been one of my favorite poems to teach by her. And like a student had suggested it. I think he might have suggested it because it's short. But the reason I've never liked it that much, I've never enjoyed teaching it, is because like for me, and I don't want to add a note of irreverence into this, sometimes to my ear, Dickinson sounds so certain, so almost well, just so certain in her message that I have not found her at her most interesting. Like for me, the one about keeping the Sabbath in her garden is a little bit like that. Doubtless I'm misreading it, but you know, it's kind of it's sort of a bit of a precious sort of, I don't need to go to church. I'm at church all the time. I go to my garden and it sounds a little self-satisfied to me. Faith is a Fine Invention has struck me that way. In that, like, it's just read quickly, doubtlessly badly in my way. It's like, well, some people say they have faith, and that's a fine kind of contrivance or invention when you already see everything. But in an emergency, when stuff gets real, you're going to find yourself looking for someone with a microscope who knows how to use it, like a doctor or something like that. You know, there are fewer prayers than there are appeals to science when you're in the cancer ward, right? And in this class, though, I had a student point out to me something I'd never noticed, which was that the moment in the poem where she tells us that microscopes are prudent, it is a line that is missing a beat. Like it should be 8 syllables, but it's not. It's seven or something like that. Or no, it should be six, but it's actually five. And the student was pointing out how there's a discordance there. And at the moment she's telling us that microscopes are prudent in an emergency, there's something missing. And it's as if she's undermining herself and getting us to experience something that doesn't work about this proposition and this poem. And I just found myself thinking about that as Joseph was asking us to wonder whether Emerson's statement that it's not meter but meter making argument that matters in a poem. And so I'm going to be thinking about that a lot as I think more about this conversation moving forward. That's it.
That's brilliant, Christopher. That's really good, because then there are lots of poems, and Chris Miller's work has pointed this out, where Dickinson will use miss a beat, and that's significant. I felt a funeral in my brain is one of the examples that Kristen Miller gives. So that's a brilliant idea of the idea that meter is part of Dickinson's argument, part of what she wants to say. Yu Hong.
Okay, thank you so much for all of the amazing discussions. And then I just wanted to add something, like, again, drawing on everyone's comment, because just coincidentally, like, as I said, like, I am about to have an article on Dickinson and Emerson got published. And I just want to share what I found in the current scholarship. It's when I read through a lot of the scholarships on Dickinson and Emerson, and I found most scholars try to draw on, like, the Dickinson's connection possibly with early Emerson, and that's how they define being Emersonian, kind of like that. But when I try to read Emerson and Dickinson like in parallel to each other, sometimes I feel Dickinson's try to either rewrite or derive herself from early Emerson, but then I find some connection with later Emerson, another layer kind of jump in. So I think it makes us rethink how to actually define Emersonian. And then a few Emersonian scholars I read, like, they also try to suggest us widen our understanding of Emersonian, even though we still tend to go to his earlier works. And so this is something I want to learn more through Emersonian scholars, of course. And then it might also help us in the future when we're doing this kind of comparative reading, and how can we actually identify our scope. Yes, thank you.
Thank you. That's such an important idea, because obviously Emerson continues to write. He continues maybe to change his mind and different things. So there's different Emersons than just one. Thank you so much. Emily.
So, of course, Dickinson continued to write as well. And Chris, the next time a student wants to do Faith is a Fine Invention, I would call attention to the fact that that poem appears in 2 of the fascicles in some interesting ways. And Ellie Higginbotham has written about that in her book on the fascicles. And I would also point students to other of the faith poems, in particular, Faith is a Peerless Bridge, faith as a bridge appears twice in the poems. And it is that question of what faith is something that Dickinson is working with in some really interesting ways. And the recent book by Renee Berglund on Dickinson and Darwin also looks at exactly that. And so there's some really good work coming out from Beverly Catlett Bolin regarding this notion of faith, the flood subject. There'll be, I just saw on the program for the Dickinson Society meeting that Beverly will be presenting. And I think that's worth looking at, because I think that poem has a lot to do with the clashing and intersection of science and theology, and the changes in what was then known as natural theology during this period. So anyway, just a suggestion of if a student wants to do a short poem, take that student to another poem that complicates matters.
Thank you so much, Emily. Is there anything else that people have noticed? I mean, one of the things that Thomas and I spoke about before our meeting today is that I suggested that Dickinson finds, at least when she writes about the poet as a figure, that the poet as a figure is maybe often distant from her, and that when some of the poems that we might look at later, that writing poetry can be a bit of a struggle or a choice. So one of the poems that we might discuss, this one, Shall I Take Thee? The poet said, there's kind of a sense in which the poem is a sort of a working out of writing, and how difficult writing can be, and choosing words, and the care with which one chooses words. And some of the other poems that we've looked at, that the Martyr Poets, again, the idea of poetry being something that's difficult, poetry being about the transformation of suffering, the idea of the poet maybe disappearing behind what they've written. And that sort of strikes me as slightly different from the sort of poet figure that Emerson presents us with. So maybe, like Thomas, you were saying about the namer and the sayer, that maybe we could think about that difference. Or
well, that was exactly where I wanted to go next, because that's how he opens the poem, where he has these very large statements about what the poet is and how the poet functions, being the namer, the sayer, the representative, all of these things. But then later on in the essay, when he moves into this idea of flux and flow and metamorphosis, there is still this sense where he's sort of maybe not undermining, but transforming his earlier arguments. What does it mean for the poet to then all of a sudden be, sending away the poems and the songs for the progeny? This idea of like the poems, I think the way I described it was like the poems as spores. They go out and they grow with other readers, with other poems that I have. That's one of those ideas. I mean, in the poets light but lamps themselves go out. And then at the end of that, the last stanza, the idea of disseminating their circumference. So this concept where you have this strong, at least the strong Emersonian poetic figure, but then what really becomes important are the poems themselves and how they're moving out into the world, this, what Emerson calls the centrifugal tendency of a man. So I think Dickinson, what I really like about this pairing with Dickinson, these poems and the poet as an essay, is that it's not just here's Emerson's idea of the poet and here's how Dickinson fits this role, but rather Dickinson is revising and adding a lot to how we can understand Emerson as well.
And anybody like to respond, or would you agree, disagree, or any comments on that? So the idea of, maybe Dickinson, let's say in this poem, sort of separates the idea of this was the poet. It is that. there's a sort of a separation maybe from the speaker of the poem and this person that she's describing, the poet.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It goes back to what I said before. I'm never sure with Dickinson when she says this was a poet or poets light but lamps, where she may mean poet a little bit differently in those two poems. But is she saying all poets are like that in both cases? Or I can read both of those poems as being almost just straight up riffing on passages from Emerson's The Poet. But as the Dickinson's people at least know, and maybe everybody realizes, this was a poet has been read as a direct undercutting of Emerson at the same time, and more than once by a number of people. One way through this might be, I was thinking about what Wendy said in the comments. What are the other influences out there on them? Herder, and for me, and because I know that Wendy is writing on geology, Humboldt. But a lot of these ideas are in the air. So rather than thinking about this as a dialogue between Dickinson and Emerson, which is tempting, they lived near each other. Emerson dined with her sister-in-law and brother. They're all responding to things that are in the air. And so it's hard to track down direct echo, because they may be echoing many different things at the same time. And while Emily Dickinson certainly had read The Poet at some point, at what point, I don't know. When it came out 10 years before she was really calling herself a poet and starting to transcribe poems into fascicles. But maybe she read it later. I don't know. What are the other influences? Goethe is certainly out there, but I don't know who else.
Thank you, Dan. Anybody else? Joseph?
I'm appealing once again to the Dickinson scholars. I'm a bit thrown by that in This Was a Poet. What do you make of that? This was a poet. It is that distills amazing sense. I would be the naive reader that I am would be expecting, the person that perhaps that's implicit there. How do the rest of you? How is one to read that? It's an innocent question.
Could I just say, welcome to our world? We don't know. We need to continually discuss and interpret these things. But does anybody know?
Well, I don't know if it's a question of knowing or just how one reads Dickinson. We've already referred to Chris Miller's first book, A Poet's Grammar, where she talks about non-recoverable deletion and compression as essential to what Dickinson does. And there's recoverable deletion, and I think a responsible reader does try to recover what's deleted and decompress the compression, but that's always only going to be partial. I mean, Dickinson didn't just go crazy when she disrupted her syntax. She was doing it. She wanted it to be that way. And this was a poet. It is that which distills, and calling a poet a that, if that's what she's doing, is a little bit kind of insulting to the poet. But let other people.
Yeah. If I could just add one thing before I yield the floor. One of the most disturbing things to me is that it seems to wrong foot Emerson's definitions, which remain for the most part in in human form. He's giving definitions of what a poet is, even if he's got these powers that are in some sense beyond those of the ordinary man. It's still that sudden shift, that sudden break that is the one that I find kind of an interesting, almost as if she's taking Emerson's definitions and deliberately wrecking them, throwing a wrench into the works there.
Yeah, yes, yes, that could be the case. For me, when I interpret it, I always think of the poet as dead. So this was the poet. The poet is dead, and that's where the poet starts. Wendy.
Yeah, I think it's such a great question, Joseph. I think I was going to say, I think what you just said, that it feels like that she's using that to undo or to wreck. But I also think there's some kind of wordplay, because the this or that, the fact that the first word is this. So there's something she's kind of playing with. But that also makes me think of what we've been talking about with Emerson, like all of the kind of below the sort of deep nature that he's trying to kind of understand through language. That, especially because it's capitalized, feels like it's signaling to obviously more than one thing.
Jared?
Hi, everyone. I got here late, so this may have already been said, or some version of this, but one of the things that stays with me from this conversation is this idea of the poet as somebody who kind of creates a living architecture, right? The sort of meter making argument as a kind of like almost like an alive thing, right? And I'm struck by the fact that Emerson heard apparently in 1842. I'm sorry, Whitman heard Emerson give a lecture that eventually became this essay. And Emerson interprets this in such a way that eventually we get the 1855 Leaves of Grass, right, which is a completely different architecture. And I just think that there's something about to me, the more interesting thing is the kind of variety of ways that people responded to Emerson. He's almost like this kind of I don't know. He's sending out radio signals, and I almost feel like that's the more important thing that he sort of like puts out, as people were talking about aphorisms. He puts out these sort of like chestnuts or something, and they grow up in lots and lots of different ways. Thank you.
Thank you, Jared. Li-Sheng.
Yeah, I'm also thinking about how the idea of the poet disseminating something like the truth, something that seemed to be preoccupying both Emerson and Dickinson, and both talk about the issue of dissemination, but in different tones and with different methods. For me, the Martyr poem, for example, about the poet not telling, but writing that message in syllable, seemed to me actually quite Emersonian. Seemed to me that Emerson also focuses on the importance of poets being able to express truth, not just telling quotidian things that can be done by everyone else. And this idea of poets, painters revealing things rather than preaching. To some extent, I feel like that has a lot to do with how both of them think about ways poets could make truths revealed or disclosed. And the other thing I felt quite relevant would be something that was also mentioned earlier by Emily about Dickinson's relationship with theology and Emerson's. It seemed to me that Emerson seemed to be a lot more affirmative in his tone, the way he talks about God and relationship between nature and human connection to God. And Dickinson seemed to be a little bit more down into that route of negative theology, and she seemed to be using a lot more like negation rather than just affirmation to talk about that path to God there. And I feel like maybe that's why it seems that the form expression, the formalistic elements in and tonal elements that are being employed in their writings make it look like they have drastic differences. But I feel like to some extent they're also talking about exactly the same thing.
Thank you very much, Li Xing. So Christopher and then Emily.
Thanks. Just really quick. This discussion is making me think about the moment from This Was a Poet, where Dickinson writes in the third stanza of pictures the disclosure. The poet, it is he, entitles us by contrast to ceaseless poverty. And I'm thinking about all the moments in Emerson where he writes about, on the one hand, he writes about the ordinary people who aren't poets and how we just can't do it. We just can't find the words to express what it is we experience in nature. But then you have a poet, and they can do it, right? They sort of have the lamp. They have this capacity, and so then they can transmit to us. And I guess the implication is that they transmit to us in a way that makes everything suddenly make sense. That is not my experience of reading either an Emerson paragraph or a Dickinson line. It's all difficulty for me, and it's definitely difficulty for my students who just are always asking me, why not just go to ChatGPT? Why not just ask AI what this means, and so I can get to it. Right? Why the difficulty? And we know that the difficulty is part of the point. That when you get to the meaning through difficulty, something happens that can't happen without the friction. But when she says that the poet entitles us by contrast to ceaseless poverty, like that's the paradox that really sticks with me in that stanza. Like it's not Emersonian in that like the poet bequeaths onto us with a kind of generosity, the fruits of his or her kind of capacity. It's that the poet paradoxically entitles us, but what they entitle us to is poverty. Like, we're impoverished by poetry. We're not bettered by it. And I like that there's something in that hits what it is I experience so often when I'm reading difficult literature. I feel like an idiot. I feel like, why can't I get this? And I'm wondering what other people think about that. And one other thing I want to say just about that is that when Emerson writes about the other possibility that poets enrich us, really do entitle us, he very often uses the language of emancipation. He calls the poet an emancipator. He talks about the loosening of our chains, of our fetters. 1844 is a crucial year for Emerson in his own career as a public intellectual. 1844 is the year of his first public anti-slavery speech, now known as Emancipation of the British West Indies. It's the year this very collection is the collection that includes the essay Experience, which is often read by those who are interested in Emerson's developing politics as the philosophical working through his decision that other people are real, in fact, and his reckoning of what kind of politics extends from that realization and so on. So that's kind of in the mix here for me as well. Thanks.
Thank you. Emily.
So in answer to your question, Chris, about the poverty, I often, to me, that suggests exactly the feeling you describe, which is that whereas Emerson is saying the poet reveals to us that which we were not able to see, the disclosure, but that we, by contrast, we compare ourselves to the poet, and there's this sense that we lack the richness of vision that the poet has. I did want to, as an aside, I did want to mention that in the talking about other influences on Dickinson, that Chris Miller has a gloss on this. This Was a Poet, indicating that in Letter to a Young Contributor, Higginson writes, "Literature is an attar of roses, one distilled one distilled drop from a million blossoms, so that there may be an allusion to that. An additional interpretation of this poem that I've seen is that the poet in this case might be a flower, that this might be one of Dickinson's flower poems. So the poet, the flower itself, the ordinary flower by the door, is the poet. And that might explain that is there. And if we were to then turn to the Martyr Poets, I think we have a sense that for the poet, and for the painter, Dickinson does this, and I would not paint a picture. There's this, and in the your thoughts don't have words every day, and so forth. There is for the poet the choice of words, the difficulty of finding the words, the agony, if you will, of making art, is a part of the experience. And for the ordinary folk who aren't seeing the world this way, they don't have to suffer. All they have to do is look at the paintings. All they have to do is read the poems. So there are lots of contradictions at work here in the sense that we are entitled to ceaseless poverty, and the poet is to himself a fortune. That is, the robbing that has taken place is not the poet's experience. The poet's, unto him herself, a fortune. And if I say anything more, I'll be rambling.
Thank you. Thanks, Emily. Thank you. So, Wuhan?
Yeah, I also just wanted to add a little bit of my personal reflection and then to Christopher's interpretation of the poem, because I think sometimes when I'm reading Dickinson's poems, particularly those feature the idea of poet, I tend to also add another layer to that. Instead of just seeing how Dickinson portrayed the poet as a reader, but also she as a writer interacting with her literary ancestors. Because I think for Dickinson scholars, we know that literary allusions or intertextuality really pervades Dickinson's poems. So sometimes when she is writing about poet, maybe that to a certain extent also reflects how she might struggle with or even experimenting with the ways in which she can interact with other poets, and the ideas of influence, anxiety of influence, and autonomy, kind of like that. And if we add that also to her relationship with Emerson, and I think it just makes it even more interesting, because like earlier Emerson, kind of like when he wrote Self-Reliance, how his idea about his relationship with ancestors are quite different from Dickinson, from what I understand. But later on, Emerson, some of his articles like quotation and originality, that kind of the ideas started to change. And then that's where I find more resemblance between Dickinson and Emerson. So I think adding that layer just make this discussion for me even more fruitful and interesting. Yes. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So Ryan.
You're muted.
Ryan, you're still muted. We can't hear you.
I'm sorry. Thank you. What I was just starting to say when I was muted was just that it's difficult because we're all kind of creating different nodes and following different leads here and building in different directions. And so I'm going to reach back to actually something that Chris mentioned a few minutes ago that I think was valuable, the 1844 context, and it being an anti-slavery kind of year for Emerson in some ways. And the notion in this particular essay of poets as liberating gods and the emancipatory rhetoric, all of this kind of thing. And it made me think that one thing we haven't talked about here is that Dickinson at times is very cautious about the powers of the poet as well. And very concerned, for all the poems that they're disseminating their circumference. There's other poems where she's wondering whether or not, I was just thinking of poem 1268, where she talks about infection in the sentence breeds. We may inhale despair at distances of centuries from the malaria. And so this idea in Dickinson, and it's a thread that she builds on over the course of her career, is that poets are not always liberating. Poets, unless they're very, very careful, may be infusing the world with poetic germs and viruses and malaria and so forth. The other place where I wanted to it's maybe not quite a connection to that, but is I think relevant in terms of the Emerson and Dickinson relationship, is that and though this brings in rather than this particular essay by Emerson, it brings in another one of his works, Nature, is that Dickinson is very much focused on eyes in a lot of poems. And eyeballs in Dickinson, I think, are sometimes in conversation with the Emersonian eye, the transparent eyeball. But with Dickinson, very often eyes are not always, but very often she's thinking about a kind of epistemological possessiveness. And she has a kind of epistemological cautiousness, again, that I think is in some tension with the idea of poets necessarily being liberating gods. I think there are places where you can find that liberatory message, maybe not in a political sense so much in Dickinson, but nevertheless a liberatory message. But there are other places where I think she's very concerned about this kind of tapping into power and the poet's power. She questions that pretty deeply at times.
Yeah, I wanted to actually pick up on that when you're talking about, so it's interesting to talk about the power of the poets using imagery. When I read through this essay this time, I noticed every time that Emerson was using very specific nature references to nature. At one point he says primal warblings. And I've been heading out to Mount Auburn lately and doing phenology. So I've been very specifically studying nature as it evolves over the springtime. And this is a bit of a personal observation, but this is what makes nature especially salient to me. And it's interesting all the mentions that we've been talking about of calling out nature, and the mention I think that Emily had said of the this was the poet, it is that actually being a flower connects the martyrdom and all of this of like, yes, using all of these, using the metaphor of nature as the central symbol of beauty, I think is especially standing out to me lately.
Thank you so much, Tammy. Felicia Ninu?
Hi, am I unmuted?
Yes.
Thank you. Okay, in connection with the idea that poetry is not necessarily liberating, I just wanted to inflict on you something I had in the Chronicle of Higher Education in response to Shelley's claim, poets are the unacknowledged liberators of the world. If poets influenced our laws, it mightn't be so good because their views are sometimes quite unsound. Consider Eliot or Pound.
That's wonderful, wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any so we've got another 7 or so minutes left. Does anybody would like to come back to any of the poems by Dickinson, or come back to the poet if anybody says something else that you'd like to say, or connection you'd like to make?
Can I quickly jump on what Tammy was just saying earlier about this reference of Emerson to his nature essay, and to think, I would like to just maybe ask the Emersonian scholars here to talk a bit more about Emerson's relationship with nature, because in this poet essay, it seems that a lot of those natural images are there. They seem very real, but at certain times could seem to be more symbolic and abstracted. And so I'm just a bit like I'm just a bit curious because he also has this reference to the spirit of plants and animals, and how I think there was a point where he quotes someone mentioning that the world, a Greek philosopher, the world is an animal, some sort. Um, I took it as a way to talk about the idea of wilderness or being wild. The poet has to be wild or something like that. But I wonder whether more can be sort of say about his connection to those natural imagery there. Are they supposed to be treated as like real objects or more as symbols for Emerson there? I guess this is a complicated question. It could be both yes and no, but I'm just curious.
Wait, in 5 minutes, I don't think we can do that. But no, it's a it's a great question. Actually, I like this too because it kind of brings me to going back in circles. One of the things that really struck me as I was preparing in some of my personal notes, I have two scholars like relatively recently. Um, let's see. One of them, Stephanie Tingley, has a piece talking about Dickinson's flower language and connecting it specifically to transcendentalism and Emersonian correspondence. So this general idea that things in nature correspond to things in the mind. You can study nature, and then that also means you're studying the mind. But then 5 years before that, Elizabeth Hewitt says, absolutely not. Dickinson's lyric is rejecting Emersonian correspondence. So I think correspondence is probably the main thing that we would need to think about with Emerson. How much is studying nature about actually studying the human, studying the self? Whereas I tend in my readings of Dickinson to see her a little bit more Thoreauvian. I mean, the fact that as a child she was wandering around Amherst and doing some of the same work that Thoreau was doing in Concord. I think for Dickinson, nature is nature in a way that it's not for Emerson. But I think, correspondence, this idea that it means something about the mind would be the main thing we should think about.
Anybody else? Any other Emersonians like to get in there? Yes, Prentice.
Yeah, just building on Thomas and also in response to that question, I also think of the word harmonies. So in Emerson's letter to Lydian, when he describes himself as a poet, he says he means poet as quote unquote a perceiver and lover of like the dear harmonies in nature, but that are also like reflected or corresponding with humankind. So like that language of, and I don't have the quotation right in front of me, but that language of harmonies, and that the poet is someone who perceives and loves those harmonies and observes them.
Wonderful, thank you. Anybody else like to add?
Maybe just a quick note on the Dickinson Journal having two special issues on Dickinson ecologies out. We have not had any submission about Dickinson and Emerson yet, so I could see how potentially fruitful our collaboration will be. Yes.
Thank you. So we've only got 2 minutes left, but just to say that Thomas and I would love to organize another meeting of the Emerson and the Dickinson Society, and maybe we could talk about some of the other essays, Circle or Nature, and link them to Dickinson poems. So if you've enjoyed this or you found it useful, then maybe there's more to come. If that's something that Thomas you think is a good idea.
Absolutely. I think we haven't even really talked about the flux or metamorphosis, the things that I think are really key here in the poet, that there's a lot of connections. Actually, what I'll share, just as a last quote here, I just think it's really appropriate. This idea that I just put it in the chat, An imaginative book renders us much more service at first by stimulating us through its tropes than afterward when we arrive at the precise sense of the author. And I don't think we've arrived at the precise sense of anything yet, but it's still stimulating with these tropes. So this has been a wonderful discussion and hopefully the first of many.
So I guess we'll stop there. This will be available on our YouTube channel. Thank you all so much for your wonderful words of wisdom and these great connections that we're making between these two immensely important writers. So thank you very much, and goodbye.
Thank you so much for organizing this.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Have a nice weekend, everyone.
It was really
Thanks,
wonderful.
Ellen.
Thank you so
Likewise to
much.
you.